Yeah, thank you very much for this very nice and kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here and very honored to give this Herz lecture on inequality of opportunity and mentoring. I think we have 90 minutes, if I'm right. And I would actually like to use all the time, including discussion right away. So if you have questions, comments, remarks, if you want to criticize anything, there won't be anything, I'm pretty sure, but in case there is something, please feel free. I'd rather do this on the go rather than devoting time at the very end. All right. Okay. So what is this paper and this project I'm going to talk about all about? I guess it goes without much saying that there's some growing concern about increasing inequalities and lack of social mobility, actually from two angles. One is from a fairness or equity notion, justice notion. People, would say it's just not fair, right? That some people have a lot, others have little, and we don't want this, right? On a pure, preferential level, if you like. There's another motivation, a more econ type motivation, which is it's also very inefficient because we're not living up to the potential of our own society, right? And not using the potential of our skills and talents among people who are disadvantaged. Now, if you think about the sources of inequality, this in itself, of course, would be easily a talk or a day or a week, right? To just think about it. But in a nutshell, and very much condensed, there are two competing views. One is that lack of success is ultimately and essentially due to lack of effort. So in some sense, it's your choice or your own fault, if you like. If you're not rich because you don't work, fine, right? I don't care, right? If you prefer to be lazy and poor, fine, there's no problem with that. That's an extreme view on one side. The other view, that is the one that I'm trying to push today, is that humans differ in the access to resources that are necessary to achieve success in life, and that these starting conditions are very unequally distributed early on, when life begins. And they are really critical particularly in the formative years, in how we become who we are, and later also in terms of how inequalities develop. And in fact, there's mounting evidence that early life circumstances, and in particular socioeconomic status, really matters. To illustrate this, I have a very quick overview on 4 papers here. I might want to start with this figure here. You don't need to know all the details. This figure is taken from a paper by Asa and Curry. Shows that inequality really starts as early as in the womb, right? Even prenatal, if you like. It shows differences in birth weight, percentage of kids with a birth weight lower than 2,500 grams, depending on parental background, like African American versus white, high school versus college, single versus married, and the biggest gap here, this is African Americans only with high school versus whites with college degree. You see there's actually pretty big differences, right? And you could really call this luck of birth, right? No one of us chose our parents, right? This, as Jim Heckman says, this is a missing market in some sense. Here's another example. This is log family income. So this is poorer families, richer families, and this is coded in reverse order. This is not my graph here. So larger numbers imply lower health status. So these people have a worse health status than these people. And as you can see, the richer the family background is, the better is the health status of kids. And this is true for kids age 0 to 3 years, 4 to 8, 9 to 12, or 13 to 17. There's not much of a difference. But there's a very heavy gradient in terms of income, right? So richer parents, richer families have more healthy kids. This is a graph from Cunha and Heckman showing by quartiles of the income distribution, the development over age 3 here, age 14, cognitive skills. As you can see, cognitive skills are highest for people coming from top income families and lowest for people from low income families. And again, this is pretty much stable over the lifespan from 3 to 14. And then finally, in the upper right corner is data from a paper of my own. It's a paper on the socioeconomic status and preferences and IQ. And it shows the high to low socioeconomic status gap. I'm going to be very much more explicit later when I talk about more detail about papers, what I have in mind when I say socioeconomic status here. But just as a motivating example, kids at age 8, this is what we show here, differ systematically in terms of their preferences and IQ depending on parental background. This is data from Germany. So people who are coming from a high SES background are 0.65 roughly of a standard deviation more intelligent. This is both crystallized and fluid IQ is a pretty comprehensive IQ test. They are more patient. These are incentivized experiment. They're less willing to take excessive risks, and they're more altruistic. And these are significant factors. If you zoom in here in more detail, why we see these socioeconomic status differences in preference and IQ, it very much depends on parenting styles, and I'm not going to talk about this, but there seems to be, or we measure this, very systematic differences in how parents from low versus high SES backgrounds treat their kids in terms of, how authoritarian or how warm the parenting style is, etc. And we do some back of the envelope calculation and say how much would it be possible to kind of, close these SES gaps in terms of patience, risk-taking, and altruism, in terms of parental investment versus endowing with more resources. And when it comes to preferences, it's really the approach that parents take vis-a-vis their kids that matters much more than, say, their formal education or income. This is just to motivate that very important things. This is, further motivation. This is showing PISA scores. This is educational performance and opportunity based on whether I have parents who have or who have not tertiary educational training. In a nutshell, what this figure shows, there's large disparities. There would be no disparities for these different countries. These are all European countries. If the gap was 0, but you can see that in all countries, depending on what type of specific study it is, PISA versus PIAC, and there are differences between countries, but in all of these countries there are SES gaps in terms of educational performance. These are educational performance indicators. Now, all the evidence that I've shown you so far is purely correlational, right? There's no causal statement. This is just measuring, traits, say, taken kids from some environment versus another. Okay, so let's say this is a problem. Socioeconomic status and life conditions early on make a difference. Then there's a prominent, and this is just one quote here, a prominent political quest for this, societies to do something about it. As Roman put it, society should do what it can to level the playing field among individuals during their period of formation. And this is exactly what this talk is about, and I'm going to show you what we try to exactly do this. This is the question reformulated in some sense. Can we actually unequal starting conditions arising from can we level unequal starting conditions arising from differences in socioeconomic status? Okay, this is what this talk is about. And the channel or the instrument that I'm going to study is a mentoring program that is quite popular in Germany. So what I want to do in this talk is I want to first introduce to you the so-called BRIC family panel. It's an ongoing panel study that I started roughly 10 years ago. Then I'm going to talk about 2 blocks. One is mentoring and schooling decisions. I'm going to show you that there are socioeconomic status differences in educational attainment, which is probably not super surprising to most of you. There are some interesting twists to that data, though, and I'm going to highlight it. But more importantly, we show that differences can be remediated with the help of a mentoring program. And this is causal evidence, because mentoring status was randomly assigned, right? This is a large RCT. And then the second block is looking into what does this changed social environment through this mentoring program do with respect to preferences like prosociality and honesty, What does it do in terms of inequalities between the genders? We look into gender gap in competitiveness and wage expectations, and ultimately life satisfactions among kids, okay? All of these are separate papers, and I could devote easily 60 minutes to each of those, so I will highlight some of the main findings, and I hope it will be clear. If not, please ask questions, right? If I'm rushing too much, then just let me know, okay? That's the plan for now. Okay. Now, the brick family panel looks like this. There are tons of details that I'm not talking about. Happy to answer your questions, but in light of interest and time, I think I can be brief here. We started. When exactly did we start? This doesn't work, unfortunately. This is where I have to. We started in 2011, right? And invited all families in the cities of Cologne and Bonn in Germany, all families who had kids who were in second or third grade, roughly 18,000 families. And we asked them, do you want to participate in a mentoring program, which we make possible, but only for a small subset of families due to capacity constraints, and all of that is actually the case, right? We never cheated at them at any point in time. And then we also said, if you're interested in this mentoring program, we would also ask you to take part in an ongoing panel study. Now, this is 2011. I wasn't sure that I would be able to continue this 10 years and above, but I always hope to do that. And we are extremely satisfied with panel attrition. There's of course attrition, but it is very, very moderate. For people who are interested in setting up a panel, so-called Panelpflege, that's a German term, how to treat your participants in a nice way, such to make sure that they're actually following you over years and years to come. Is super important, and many panel studies suffer from attrition. We were quite lucky and did a lot of things to keep this going. So in 2011 we had these participants. We looked at their applications and sorted people according to high and low socioeconomic status. Again, we could have a long discussion about what is high and low socioeconomic status, and there's variation in the literature, etc. For now, let's just go with this definition. You are classified as low SES parental background if the income is low. What that exactly means are all details I'm missing. This is roughly 30, if it's below 30% of the income distribution in Germany. If none of your parents has a higher education, so doesn't have Abitur, or a single parent. And if one of these criteria is fulfilled, you are classified as low SES. All the analysis we do, we always do with various groups. For example, only single parent but educated, or not educated but rich, right? And you have all these combinations in the data set. For now, we just go with this very simple distinction. You're low SES if your parents have low income or are not educated or are single parents. Otherwise, you're categorized as high socioeconomic status, okay? And this then means that we have two basic groups. One is high socioeconomic status, these red kids and their families, and low socioeconomic status. And we oversampled low socioeconomic status here. These are the gray guys. And then among the low socioeconomic status families, we randomized a subset into the mentoring program. All wanted to participate, which also means that everything I'm going to tell you and talk about is true only conditional on someone wanting to take part in a mentoring program, right? That's a potential caveat. You could also say it's a feature rather than a bug. Why? Because this is a mandatory program. So from a policy perspective, we actually want to know what are the effects of a program that is voluntary. So look at people who are interested in participating voluntarily, right? But you cannot generalize any of these findings to a program that would be mandatory. See what I'm saying? So it is in that sense a selected sample. We do many things later in the papers to kind of compare our sample to the German population at large, which we can because many of our measures are exactly identical to the measures on purpose that the so-called socioeconomic panel uses. This is the biggest panel in Germany, has about 20,000 participants that are asked each year. And we use that panel to kind of, derive weights for our sample to kind of say what would be the expected effect sizes had we recruited a representative sample. And typically, nothing changes. I mean, honestly, it's essentially the same. Right? Okay, anyways, so we have these two groups, high SES and low SES, and then we have this random selection here into a mentoring program and no mentoring program. And that means we have 3 study groups. And that's important for all of the papers that I'm going to discuss later. We use the comparison between low SES without mentoring and high SES without mentoring to look at the descriptive differences between personality and human development depending on socioeconomic background. Okay, this is descriptive. That's, for example, what I was showing you on the previous slide, talking about preferences by SES. That's a comparison between those guys and those guys here. Okay, to study the causal effect of a changed environment through mentoring, in this case, we compare these two groups. And the typical paper we write here is we look at gaps that open up between low and high SES kids, and then we ask the question, how much of the gap can we actually fill if we provide resources to kids from a low socioeconomic background that they typically don't have, that they don't dispose of, okay? That comes through this mentoring program. That's essentially the idea of everything I'm going to do later. Okay. And again, there's many things I'm leaving out, and I do understand that you may have many questions about some details, but I hope by and large it's clear what this is doing. As I said, we started with roughly 700 kids who were in 2nd or 3rd grade in 2011. Since then, we've had, I think, 8 waves. We started at central location labs. These were essentially flats, which we rented to run the interviews, which were all run by professional interviewers. We have high quality measures of tons of things, developmental inputs like socioeconomic status, maternal traits, parenting styles, how stressed the parents are, how the home environment looks like, traits of the mother and the father, like their preferences, etc. And what they actually do with their kids, how close the interaction is that they have, what they engage in, how intense the social interaction is, quality time, quantity time, etc., etc. We have good outcomes on child outcomes, in particular traits. That's what I was, mostly interested at the beginning, at least. So how do these preferences, big 5, locus of control, political attitudes, etc., how do they develop over the life course in the first place, net of any, a change in the social environment, which in itself is interesting. There's no paper that looks at within person at the development. There are many papers that look at younger, middle, old, and older kids, say, comparing, say, one trait. Like here, you can look at all these traits because they're all measured in concert, but also within person and how people develop, right? So it's a much better data set for how preferences actually evolve, right? And then you can always look into how this evolution of preference and personality, etc., operates in interaction with the social environment. But later in life, of course, and my first paper I'm going to talk about is actually about schooling. Outcomes matter too, right? We're in some sense very interested in who we become and how and what that depends on, but also how this then later plays out into actual decisions and outcomes. Because going back to my initial question, I'm asking the question how we can remediate these inequalities, right? And they come about through choices ultimately. So one is schooling. In later years, I hope that we will also look into labor market prospects, etc., now that they are about to leave school, etc. As I mentioned very briefly, it's only 2 bullet items. Again, this is of course very rough. The mentoring program is called Baloo and You, Baloo and Do. it's a little like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, some program that you might have heard of, which is quite popular in the US. The mentoring program, the idea of this mentoring program, which was developed by education professor Müller-Kohlenberg, is so-called informal learning. So it's not an achievement program. It's not to make kids better at school, to train specific skills, etc. It is to widen horizons, foster self-confidence, to allow them to experience new experiences, and to interact with an attachment figure that brings in resources that are scarce or even absent in a given household. For example, suppose you are born into a low SES, low educated household. There's no one who has an experience at some higher level school, not to speak of university or even an academic track or something, right? So the whole notion, the whole concept in some sense is unknown and strange to people, right? And then it is much more difficult for someone to develop a taste for becoming an academic, right? Because you're just missing these role models in some sense, right? And now these mentors, who are all university students, and most of them are female, come into these families and bring exactly these experiences in the household, right? They show to their parents and their kids, and these kids, look, we are regular people, right? Just because I'm a university student, I'm not a freak, or and look, he is smart, right? He could do this too, and you could do this too. This sort of resources. That's what I would want you to think about. Right? It lasts roughly 1 year, and mentors come to see a child once per week for the duration of an afternoon, and they engage in versatile activities from eating cake, discussing, listening to music, just playing, talking, visiting the zoo, this sort of things, right? And informal learning means, for example, you're telling the kid, let's meet at 3:15 at the bus station, right? So the kid makes the experience and learns to be on time, to be punctual, to have a meeting. All these very basic things are brought to the kid through this mentoring, right? And it's not that, let's do homework, 2 plus 2 is not 5, is closer to 4 or something. That's not what it is, okay? All right. And I think that is actually very important, that mentors are role models. And I think this is an aside, my view of the world, which is worth nothing perhaps, so take it just as a personal, subjective and maybe wrong statement. My view of the world is we become mostly who we are through imitation. So the whole notion that economists put forward, like investment, is like treating these kids like machines. You press buttons and then you do this and this, and then I don't think that's how it works. Kids imitate, right? And if you're friendly, they are on average more friendly, right? If you're more trusting, they are more trusting. If you're taking more risks, they are more risk-taking, right? If they experience you to be open, friendly, communicative, etc., etc., etc. I'm not saying it's a copy, right? It's not a blind copy, a simple copy of your parents, but I think that imitation process. It's, by the way, also the way, you're the experts here in this institute, but that's the way how we essentially learn, right? How we learn, pick up languages, etc., etc. So imitation is important, and therefore a role model is important, right? And I will come back to this when I talk about interaction effects of the treatment, exploiting the fact that we know something about parents. And one of the ideas is, suppose there's a positive effect on prosociality. Should it be bigger or smaller? If the mother is already prosocial, if what I'm saying is right, it should be, the treatment effect should be weaker, right? Because that role model was already in the family context. If it was absent, then there was more room for a role model to actually fill this gap and affect behavior. There was a question in the back?
I was wondering if you could tell a little bit more about the kind of process, how mentor and mentee come together. Is it a random assignment, or is it a sampling process and both sides choose?
That's a good question. We two quick answers. One is, we didn't intervene at all. We did all the organization, but none of the players knew that this is part of a study. Okay, so we were trying to build many firewalls between kids and their mentors and the Baloo and Do and us. Okay, that's one important thing to mention. The other is it is basically random, conditional on location. So let's say you are a mentor living in Cologne, you will most likely not be met with a mentee from Bonn, and vice versa. And within Cologne is not as big as Berlin, but it's a big city. In Cologne, the more proximity is an indicator. And for almost all matches, it was more or less random. But then, in a few cases, when the match didn't work out very well, very rare cases, I don't have the number in the back of my mind, but it was few cases, but we have documented them. There was a reshuffling, which happened very rarely. And some of the intended matches didn't work out because a mentor moved away, because the family moved away, etc. All I show you is intention to treat estimates, so it's very conservative. We intended you to meet someone, and about 10% of the intended to treat kids never saw a mentor, but had planned to meet a mentor, and this is why they're in the treatment group, despite the fact that they never actually saw a mentor. So to be on the conservative side, you can also do the other calculations and do the total effect size, and then treatment effects typically go up a bit. Yes, please.
And a quick follow-up on that. Also, did you train the mentors in any
good
way, or did you assess?
Again, we use a professional infrastructure of a well-developed program. And all the training and everything is done by the organization Baloo and You. The way it works is people are recruited, then they meet and they're educated. They get material, what's the idea of the project, what can you do with these kids? And then they meet every 2 weeks. They meet a professional coordinator in groups. So let's say you are all mentors and I'm a coordinator. We meet every 2 weeks, and then we discuss issues you might have with kids, some things that didn't work out. Maybe you have a question about, what can I do if she doesn't want to do this, or are there, who has better ideas what to do with kids, etc., etc. There's also diaries that the mentors are asked to write. To actually document what they do, and this is to some extent, of course, endogenous. For example, if you're matched with a kid that likes to play football, let's say, then the mentor might play football, right? If she or he wants to do, ice cream, then you go ice cream. So there's some endogeneity here, but it's embedded in a professional infrastructure. Yeah? But it's unpaid. It's unpaid. There's a little money that the matches get. The pairs to do things like visiting the zoo, etc. So there's some money that, or taking a bus ride or something, but not a lot of money. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Another question.
No, of course. Yes.
Now, we could imagine that the mentoring success is also a function of whether or not the mentor, him or herself, comes from a low socioeconomic background.
Yeah.
It's even more persuasive to have such a model.
Yeah.
Is the sample size big enough to look at the possible effect?
It's a brilliant question. We have looked into some of these interactions, but the sample size is not that big. So in general, I totally agree. And there are other interactions that you might want to look at. For example, female-male match versus female match, etc. Many of these interactions would be very interesting. The problem is a bit, these would never be causal in the sense that whatever these guys do with each other is endogenous to what they want to do, right? In terms of a causal statement, I can only say you did have a mentor, you did not, right? That is safe and that is clean. The moment that I zoom in, it becomes a little shaky, but I think this is a very plausible hypothesis. Street credibility of mentors is super important, right? It's also used sometimes in for kids who have drug problems. That someone who's pretty known, a rapper or I don't know, some football player or something who also had these problems, comes to visit these classes and says, look, I was one like you, and I know exactly what I'm talking about, and they do or do not have that credibility, and for exactly these reasons, right? That it makes it even more plausible to say, maybe I should listen and maybe that is interesting what this person has to tell me. But we don't have, I don't know if we know their parental background. I don't. We did a survey. In any case, I don't think the power would be strong enough. It is a shame that studies like this are run by someone like me and not full scale, huge sample, and then really look into the specific details. It's also some matches work better than others. Why, right? And how could we improve that and make him even more productive, etc. These are all very important questions which I think are beyond the scope of our data here. Okay, I should probably hurry up a bit. Okay, so here's my first paper, really. It's with Pia Pinger, a colleague from Cologne, wonderful scholar, and Fabian Kost, a good friend and long-run co-author and former student of mine. He's now in Munich. Here's the background. In most OECD countries, there's early tracking. And tracking can lead to a mismatch that reinforces inequalities, reducing average performance. If, what do I mean here? Well, mismatch is if, say, you're very talented, but you're low SES, and because there's, prejudice that you're dumb because you're low SES background, let's say, there's a mismatch. You go to the low track when, in fact, you should have gone to the high track, and that can, of course, easily reinforce inequality. So it's important to see how this tracking itself depends on socioeconomic status, okay? In Germany, tracking takes place particularly early in OECD comparisons, and social mobility is also low. I'm not showing you supporting graphs here. Berlin, by the way, for those who might wonder, Berlin is an exception to this. Here it's only after grade 6, but in most states in Germany, after grade 4, you essentially is a little more complex, but essentially there are two tracks. One is the low track, leading to vocational and apprenticeship type of careers, and the high track, which is, if you like, the academic track that can lead to college and university. And there's relatively little going back and forth between these tracks once you've been decided to go either the high or the low track, right? So just to fix ideas, after grade 4, you're sorted into either the high or the low track, okay? There are important quality differences. Again, I'm not showing you the data, but just trust me. You have different peers if you're in the high track than in the low track, right? You meet different kids and people and parents and backgrounds and networks and all that stuff. Teacher pay is higher in high track. The amount of instruction is higher. There are more and diverse academic subjects, and of course occupational opportunities are also much better. Here, further advantages of a high track career. The discount of, if you by 3% lifetime earnings of university graduates are roughly 1 million. Apprenticeship training 600,000. So huge differences, right? Depending on which track you've been into. This is data from a paper here that you can read yourself. But there's other outcomes that are shaped by the question whether you enter high or low track. This is data from the socioeconomic panel. This is our own calculations. This is standardized life satisfaction over the life cycle. This is here from age 20 to age 80. I'm pretty much here, so there's hope that it will get better. Ralph, for you, the worst time is yet to come. Anyways, but maybe I'm on this graph. I just realized I did the high track. So nevertheless, the dip is the same, but as you can see, there's a clear level. This is not causal. It's just giving you some feeling for these things really matter, right? I mean, and even if it's only descriptive, right? High versus low track. This is how it translates into happiness in Germany. This is how it translates into subjective health status. This time it's coded more naturally, so this goes down. I mean, health status typically goes down with age. This is true for both, whether you attended or did not attend the high track degree. But again, you see, big differences here. And I could add to this very long list that this early decision matters, right? So here's my first question. Do we observe an inequality of opportunity gap for low SES children in our family, in our BRIC family panel? And the answer is yes. And this is in line with associations that have been reported before between parental socioeconomic status and the transition into either high or low track, right? Now, there are two gaps that we could look at now in terms of SES and the transition into high versus low track. The first, that I call unconditional gap, the raw gap, is just the gap that I get if I don't control for anything, but just look into high versus low SES, right? That informs us about differences in transition, but, you know, perhaps it is not just inequality of opportunity, because after all, remember my initial statement, perhaps these high SES kids just perform better and they work harder, right? Now you could say, but that in itself is also driven by maybe, you know, where they're coming from. Yet another very important question, right? Can we hold someone accountable for the fact that he or she works harder, right? Is it my fault that I find it more difficult to, you know, concentrate, to be persistent, to be conscientious, etc., right? Or is that in itself also maybe predetermined by either genetics or whatever, right? By social status. But that's yet a different story. So let's say, okay, they just work harder and then they deserve more. So this is maybe just the upper bound of inequality of opportunity. And in fact, they do have a better GPA. They have better grades, right? High SES kids have better grades. So why not using the gap conditional on school performance? That is the one that informs us about inequality of opportunity bias, net of effort and skill levels or circumstances, and it's what I call the lower bound of inequality of opportunity. And how do they look like? It looks like this. This is the likelihood of high track attendance in 5th grade. So after grade 4, you have to go high versus low. Mean for low SES is 0.48. This is the high SES dummy, so they have a 31% higher chance of entering the high track than low SES kids. Okay, 31% higher. Okay, no controls. This is controlling for age and gender, doesn't do much. This is controlling for grades, the GPA score at the end of grade 4, right, at the end of elementary school. And here you can see that the gap drops. So if you want, this is the lower bound of inequality of opportunity, and this is maybe the upper bound, depending on whether you would say that GPA in itself is not predetermined through SES, right? But that's the ballpark. And that number is also kind of striking, because what it says is you have two kids, they have the same grades. Your family is, say, high SES, sorry for the example, yours is low SES, right? His chances are 20% higher than yours, conditional on the same grades, okay? That's Germany today, right? That's what it is. Okay, that's the starting point. So in some sense it's good for us because, you know, unless there's some you know, gap in SES, there's not much we can close, right? Okay, second question. Can access to a highly educated mentor, you know, remember, role model, etc., reduce the unconditional and the conditional SES gaps in access to education? And the answer is, show you in a second. Potential influence of high SES high track mentor in a low education environment. How can, you know, why could that happen? You know, what is the hypothesis here? Well, one is, you know, a mentor, a high SES mentor, they are all university students, right? They are, you know, representing this high track, if you like. They could motivate the child to strive and aim high, and then these kids get better recommendations. I'm going to show you the effect of recommendations later. At the end of grade 4, actually a little earlier, the school teachers write a recommendation on behalf of the child and recommend the high or the low track. In North Rhine-Westphalia, in most other states, this is not binding, right? In some states it is binding, here it is not binding. So if you get a low recommendation, you might as well send your kid to the high track. If you get a high track, you might as well send it to the low track, okay? So you could either get a better recommendation because the kid did better, or it informs parents, so that would be a very different channel. It tells, you know, the parents, look, the kid isn't that dumb, you know, and he or she is well suited to go for the high track. and then parents take different decisions. So these two channels is something that I'm going to look at later. But first I want to show you the causal effect of the mentoring program on the critical transition from after grade 4 into high versus low track. This is the gap, this is the unconditional gap that I was showing you before. This is control low SES, no mentoring. This is control high SES, no mentoring about high SES. This is the difference, 31%. And this is the treated kids from low SES. And as you can see, there's a significant 11 percentage point increase in the likelihood of entering the high track. So you can reduce the unconditional gap by about 30%. Okay? Can you also reduce the gap, the conditional gap? The answer is yes. The performance as adjusted gap, let me show this right away. This is a little detail, but I think I'm running a bit out of time. Where's the gap? Oh, here it is. Okay, that's the gap. This is the SES gap that I showed you before. This is the unconditional treatment effect. This is the conditional gap, is a bit smaller, and this is the treatment effect conditional on grades, is almost exactly identical, which means that, technically speaking, random assignment of the mentoring program is orthogonal to the grades that kids had at grade 4, right? And that means that the conditional gap is almost closed by 50%. Okay, so depending on what notion of inequality of opportunity you like to use, this one or this one, you are in between closing the gap by 30 to 50%. That is pretty much what we can say here. Okay, and I think this is quite amazing in some sense because it's a low invasive treatment. It costs very little. The highest cost is actually the opportunity cost of the mentors. Perhaps it was good for them as well, so I'm not sure about exactly what the costs are, but it essentially is a very cheap project. Did I say something wrong? Is that the bullshit alarm? Shut the... I understand, I can quit any... I should make fun of that. I can stop any point in time. All right, okay. Now, you could question this finding, right? You could say, oh, maybe you thought that the wrong kids in the wrong program, right? Why did you interfere with you know, etc. Let's go through this step by step. You know, one argument is low SES kids are sent to low tracks, to the low track to actually avoid down tracking and distress. So suppose you believe that low SES kids are not capable of, you know, excelling in the high track, then it would be better for them because otherwise they will be downgraded, they will later be moved down track and they are more stressed. However, both the conditional and the unconditional treatment effect are enduring and remain almost equal in size in grade 5, in grade 6, in grade 7. That's the beauty of a panel, right? You can look at the treatment effect year by year. It's always the same, right? There's no down tracking and there's no up tracking, almost none, right? And that's very typical for the German school system. And more importantly, it's not different by treatment status, right? So there's a 1 to 3% up and downgrading between kids, you know, from high to low versus high track, but it's completely, you know, independent of treatment status. And we don't see any adverse effects on grades or school satisfaction. So if you ask the kids who were in the treatment, are you happy with school? They're equally happy than the kids in the control condition. Likewise, you know, grades aren't worse than those of their high SES colleagues, right? So let's say we're in the same class, you are high SES and I'm low SES, but I was in the treatment, now we're in the same. Our grades are not, you know, distinguishable. So it's not that, you know, they were pushed over some threshold and now they suffer and they are worse off. We don't have any indication for that, right? We don't. Okay. But we looked, because it is a possibility, right? Now, a little further detail, why did we see what we see? The institutional setting stipulates a two-stage decision process. First, you know, when the kid is in class 3, roughly, they receive, and early in 4, they receive a track recommendation, as I said before. It's a transcript and a teacher evaluation of children's prospective performance. So what they typically say is, oh, I think Armin would be better in the low track because and that's what the parents get. Or they get, Ralph would be better in the high track, and then, then the parents can decide, because that is ultimately not the kid's decision, but the parents' decision. And then parents decide based on the recommendation. In our context here, and that's nice for our study, they are free to overrule the recommendation. And the school acceptance is not depending on the recommendation. So say I get a bad recommendation, I overrule it, then the school can't say, oh, you overruled a bad recommendation or low track recommendation, you can't do this. That's not what it is, okay? The schools have to accept that. So the question is, do high and low SS kids receive different recommendations? Conditional or unconditional on grades? So is that the source of the gap, right? Or is it that parents make different decisions based on that signal, right? Truth is, both matters, right? How do we know? Well, we have the track recommendations, and we know how the parents decided. So this is teacher recommendations. These are these recommendations for the high track. That's the baseline for low SES, and this is the high SES treatment dummy. So high SES kids get almost 30% higher likelihood of getting a high track recommendation, unconditional, and roughly 20% conditional on grades. So again, 2 kids, same grades, the teacher is more likely to give you a high recommendation if you are from a high SS background. Okay? That's part 1. Part 2 is parental decision making. And here's something that is interesting, that high SES parents, if they get a low recommendation, they are significantly more likely to overrule this relative to low SES parents, right? And that's exactly where the mentor could play an important role, right? It's boosting the confidence in the kid, right? And helps the parents to say, no, look, he has a 1, a 0, a very good, or good, an A, a B, this type of, grades, let's say. Why not? Why not try, right? Boosting a bit that confidence. And we do some analysis along those lines, and we find effects for this, right? High track given a low recommendation, significantly higher for high SES than for low SES, and also more confidence on sending the kid to high track given a high track recommendation is also higher for high SS families, right? So that's yet another channel which I don't have time to talk about, but sometimes it's this, oh, who do you think you are, right? We are all in our neighborhood and peers, we're all good, craftsmen, no one ever went to college, we don't need this, we don't want this is not for us, right? This is not for you. What do you think would he or she talk, etc. You get what I'm saying, right? So even if you get a good recommendation, more reluctance on behalf of the parents, right? And then I'm skipping a bit some details and just show you what, if you do a decomposition of the treatment effect that we see, we can say that roughly 30% is the recommendation effect. So 30% of the treatment effect is that kids get better recommendations, and the rest is parental decision effect. So the effect of the mentors on overruling and making them more confident in sending the kid is also very important, right? And that's pretty much what we do in this paper. So summing this up, we do some robustness, validity, if for those who are interested, different estimates. This is going back to what I said before. Do they generalize? As I said, we oversample low SS families, and we have only families who are interested in taking part in the mentoring program. We do weighted intention to treat estimates given weights from the socioeconomic panel, and the results are extremely similar. If you do the treatment effects not for intention to treat, but accounting for the fact that not everybody participated, the actual treatment effects is as always is getting up a bit, right? So it's a bit less conservative. So summing up this paper, what we find is we document large SES gaps in education opportunity. based on tracking in the German context. Only 1/3 of the difference is explained by performance. Mentoring then reduces the inequality of opportunity gap. Conditional equality of opportunity gap can be reduced by half. The unconditional was roughly 30%, and we do find positive long-term effects. And what's also important here is the timing, right? The mentoring program was right before this decision, 1 year earlier, and I think that is pretty much, I don't know, I can't prove it because we don't have any variation in timing here really that we could exploit. But it seems plausible that the effects need some time to evolve, right? This is not like taking a drug where the moment that you take it, you're a different person or so, right? Meeting the mentor, etc., takes time, and boosting confidence and trust in this relationship, etc., takes time. And then once the program develops its full potential, this decision is taken, right? Had the program been after this decision had been taken, trivially, it couldn't have had any effect on that critical transition. This is, I think, an interesting, it's totally trivial, but nevertheless interesting. Timing is just super important, right, when it comes to interventions, right? When do you do something, right? When is the leverage, particularly strong, etc. Okay, now let me shift gears a bit and talk about mentoring, preference, and life satisfaction. Yeah, yes, please.
Looking at your results, it feels like one of the natural conclusions would be that you also need to get the teachers into some sort of program, because once they start making such wide choices, that will affect a whole bunch of children rather than taking the kids on.
There are a couple of papers that I'm aware of, and there may be many more. If people know, just mention this, please. That try to correct implicit biases. The one or two papers that I recall on the back of my mind here now are about gender stereotyping. Guess what? Girls can do math, so to say, right? This type of correction. By the way, that is often coming not only from male teachers, it's also coming from female teachers, right? And there's a couple of interesting papers that I've seen, which is a bit along those lines, right? In that very context, I'm not aware of any study, but I totally agree. Teachers should be made more aware of that very fact. Because, going back to the inefficiency of, on top of the injustice or the unfairness that we do, obviously, many kids who are capable of doing the high track, and that's probably good for our country and for our society and for our communities, etc., wouldn't have gone, right? And there's a huge potential. You can actually put a price tag on it if you like. If you take the expected lifetime income differences, this program generates millions of euros, right? Easily, millions, right? And costs almost nothing. So if you do that cost-effect ratio kind of calculations is infinitely valuable, right, in that sense. I'm just exaggerating a bit. General equilibrium effects are yet to be discussed, etc., etc. But I think, one should do more of that mentoring, I guess. But you're also right. A different, very interesting policy instrument would be to educate teachers about their explicit or implicit biases in making recommendations. Absolutely right. Yeah. Yes, please.
So there's work showing that lower income people are more present biased. Do you think one of the mechanisms by which this intervention works is by making long-term outcomes more salient?
Mm-hmm. We also find that in our sample, we don't measure present bias explicitly, we measure discounting. We didn't have the time to go into even more details, but it's closely related. And in fact, we have that SES gap here too. We don't have a treatment effect on discounting though. So I'm not saying not a good, because we don't have that explicit measure, but something that comes close. We do document the SES gap exactly as you describe it, but we didn't find that the program has any effect on it. It also didn't have an effect on risk-taking, as far as I can tell. Yes, please.
Yeah, so given the strong effect of that the parents make very different decisions when there's a mentor in play, it kind of begs the question: what is the pathway through which this happens? And one can think of a scenario where kind of a mentor actually never meets the parents, and it's really gradual change of the mentee, and then it reduces the parents to make, let's say, more choices for the higher cap. Another one could be that maybe actually the mentor is consulted in that decision where to send the mentee and maybe not really. So I'm sure you must have thought about it. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, brilliant. Short, unsatisfying answer. I don't know. We could now go back, perhaps in retrospect, and ask parents, remember those days, but we haven't done it during the decision process. We haven't asked specifically, did you mention in your interactions, and did you discuss, and I don't know. I find it very likely that it did happen, because it is an important decision, and as someone from the university comes to see me, and why not talk about it? But honest and unsatisfying answer, I don't know. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a somewhat different question, and if you wanted to get into this later. So there's work by Katie Wildman and others showing that in this mentor-mentee relationships, it's not just the mentees benefiting, but it's actually also the mentors who really take a lot out of these relationships. So I was just wondering if that's something you are also taking into account in your study.
No, but I wholeheartedly believe it is true, and I have non-scientific evidence, so to say. Mentors say that they really enjoyed this experience, and what I don't have, what I had planned initially, was to randomize potential mentors into either being mentor or not being mentor, and then study, the causal effects on, happiness, satisfaction, meaning, whatever, right? The problem is we were short on mentors because we used every single mentor we could use to have as large as a treatment group as possible, and that didn't allow us to use a design where you use some of the potential mentors and don't actually give them a mentee, right? A different design would have been a waiting list design, etc. But back then I thought this is getting too complicated, and I didn't do. But I always thought this is super interesting, and I think I've been thinking about this actually quite for some time, and one could do other easier mentoring programs and related programs and study this more thoroughly, I think, and I think it's absolutely worthwhile. Yeah. It's also important for the question, is this efficient, right? Would it make us better off as society? Because after all, the burden is right now is on the mentors, right? But if we could show that it is good even for them in whatever dimension, it would increase the efficiency of that program even further, right? Preferences and life satisfaction. Unless you don't want it anymore, then I stop. Okay. Now, why study preferences? Any model, any theory of human decision making, I would claim, be it in psychology or in economics or political science or wherever, takes as fundamental a set of preference over risk, time, and social interactions. Why? Because every decision is uncertain. Therefore, if you like it or not, risk, matters somehow. Almost every decision we take has consequences and implications for future outcomes. So, like it or not, patience somehow matters in the back, somehow. And we are socially interacting every day. So, how we approach people, how nice we are, altruistic, reciprocal, etc., matters. And also, preference shape essentially all decisions and therefore outcomes. And for someone who is interested in inequality, which are ultimately, coming about through decisions, and then if preferences are important, for decisions, then it's a natural object of study. So are preferences important for behavior? Is differences in preference an interesting and systematic source of variation in behavior? That's the question. I mean, this question is a totally crazy question in the sense that the obvious answer is yes. But in my field, in economics, it was a no-go explanation, right? We don't use variation in preferences to explain anything, right? It's a taboo almost, right? I mean, this has changed over the last 15, 20 years, but it was prices, constraints, circumstances, situational factors for psychologists, you might say, right? So in that sense, economists were wholehearted social psychologists, but not personality psychologists. They said, no, that's not a credible source of variation. Why? Because the moment that you say, look, they behave just differently because they have different preferences, anything goes, right? Then, you lose any constraints in your argument, essentially. That was the argument, right? But the downside is that you're not exploiting the very fact that humans are different, and systematically so, right? Also, the whole program would make no sense if there's no stability in preferences, right? If you wake up tomorrow with a totally different set of preferences than yesterday and me, and if everything is, and no one says everything is totally fixed. No one says there's situational factors that can temporarily make differences. But by and large, the evidence really suggests that the rank order stability is pretty stable, and there's something that is stable in this preference. By the way, we find this too in our panel here. The rank order is remarkable. Anyways, here's also some evidence. It's taken from this first paper. I'm not expecting you to read this in detail, just to show you, right? There's a collection of papers using various data sets. This is different outcomes: crime, education, health, donations, labor market, life satisfaction, education, labor market. So, this is finance, personal finance. This is results, and this is, whether it has an effect on time preference, risk preference. So, sorry, if social preference, risk preference, time preference, and or IQ matter for these outcomes, right? And a dark or grayish button here says there is an effect, and results are strong or not. This is this column here. This is page 2 of this map. It's not even conclusive, of course, but it's supposed to show, many papers have now shown that there's systematic variation in outcomes depending on differences in preferences. Okay, this is what this short excursus is supposed to be doing. Now, and how does this play out into inequality? I mean, pretty obviously, I would say. Heterogeneity in preferences and other skills contribute to unequal outcomes if preferences affect decisions and therefore outcomes. And this is pretty obvious, right? Does it affect social mobility? Yes, if the formation of preference depends on intergenerational transmission, which it does, and I'm going to show you that here and there, right? We are very much, on average, similar to our parents, if we like it or not. And if parents systematically differ by socioeconomic status, which I've already shown you to some extent, but I'm going to show you this even more in the next 30 minutes or so. So if there's starting condition differences, if this is transmitted through intergenerational transmission, if these preferences matter, then there's a role for starting preferences in the process of fostering inequalities, right? And then difference in preference between groups can actually explain difference in outcomes, for example, between genders, socioeconomic status, regions, or countries. For people who are interested, I have a series of papers where we look at the global distribution of preferences. It's the so-called Global Preference Survey. It's data that you can easily access and download yourself if you want, and we exploit it to show that even countries that differ in terms of patients, for example, are richer, that mortality rates in different countries predicts patients. There's effects of religion. We test the famous Nisbet hypothesis on reciprocity and cultures of violence, etc., depending on agricultural circumstances, pre-industrial, etc. There's a paper we recently wrote, etc., etc. So inequalities, even not only in small groups, but also between regions and countries, can be explained using variation in preferences. Okay, here's a paper that looks specifically at the formation of prosociality and provides causal evidence on the role of the environment, here measured in terms of the mentoring program, and the courses are more or less the same as before. Now, prosociality is important. Let me skip that slide. It is important. Trust me. yeah, and where do these differences come from, and is there scope for variation if we change the social environments for mentoring, right? How do we measure prosociality? We have a goal here, which is to measure it in some comprehensive way, using different facets, sources, and techniques. The facets are altruism. Here we use various dictator games. If you're interested, I can show you details. One, by the way, an interesting, which we have never exploited, difference is whether the recipient in this dictator game is a kid from your city who you don't know, or a kid from an African orphan that is living there because his parents, his or her parents, are either dead or ill. Right? And we cooperated with that orphan and sent them toys that were exchanged. Yeah, it doesn't matter what the deeds are, but exactly as we described it, to kids as well. And very early on, age 8, 9, etc., kids always give more on average to African kids to their relative to their. So there's an empathy notion here quite early on. Anyways, we have a trust measure that is a survey item. And we measure so-called general other regarding behavior using respective subfacets from the strength and difficulty questionnaire, a questionnaire that is often used to assess development, social development in kids. We use incentivized experiments, the dictator games. Child answered the questionnaire about him or herself, that's this one. And the mothers answer the questionnaire about child's behavior. This is the SDQ, right? And we have asked that battery in every single way, right? We have to adapt, of course, the payments and some of the instruction features. So, for example, think of kids that are 8 years old. Here they could earn stars that were exchanged into toys, right? Now suppose someone is 17 and you say, look, here's a star, you can earn it. You know what, you know what I want to say, and then they say, I want cash or go, leave me alone, right? So it goes. So they get cash now, of course. So we had to adapt the scales, the payments, and the wording, etc. Right at the very beginning. If you do service with kids, you know, one idea we had, and I think is cute, is we made them familiar with what it means to tick a box, you know, on a Likert scale. I have a paper on an economic model on what we actually do if we answer a survey. I think this is super fascinating. So if you shameless self-promotion, sorry for that. If you find that is interesting, check my website. It's really, really cool. We model what people actually do, and then we can actually retrieve from the modes of responses how well they know themselves. But you know, that's a different paper. Anyways, to make the kids familiar with what a Likert scale is, we asked them, "Do you like spaghetti?" Right? And very much so, not at all, right? And then it's intuitively clear, and then you have to kind of, you know, do these things to make it credible to kids that they provide you with the answers that you're really interested in. Okay, so these are our measures. We look at all these facets in isolation, of course, but let me show you the joint measure outcomes. The left panel, oh no, this is, okay, getting started. Now, let's look first at parental background. This is the prosociality of the mother. The nice feature of this data set is we have all these measures also for parents, and because at the beginning it was mostly mothers who accompanied the kid to the interviews. I'm talking about mothers, but mean to include the few fathers who took the kid to the interviews, okay? So the prosociality of mother in high SS much higher than in low SS. Huge difference, okay? Another thing that we look into very often, and I'm not talking about the details here, is the intensity of the mother-child interaction. We have many questions on what parents do with the kids, how intense they interact, okay? And we derive a score, and as you can see, the high intensity of the mother-child interaction is much more prevalent in high SES compared to low SES families, okay? So there's differences in background. And now, if you look at, and this is all descriptive evidence, if you look at the prosociality of the child, high SES kids are more prosocial, okay? Descriptive evidence. Remember this one graph with these kids, you know, when I was showing the brick pen, this is now the upper group, control high SES and control low SES. There's no treated kid in here, right? This is just the descriptions. Descriptive evidence. And the high SS dummy is positive, so kids from a high SS background are more prosocial. Their prosociality also depends on the intensity of the mother-child interaction, and it depends, something we always find, on the prosociality of the mother. So what it means is, if you have a mother who's more prosocial, the likelihood that you're more prosocial is also, so a shift in one standard deviation in prosociality of the mother is associated with a 0.25 standard deviation shift in prosociality of the child, right? That's how you have to read it. If you put it all together, you can already, this indicates that much of the SES effect actually comes from the differences in mothers that determine this SES effect. One is high SES mothers interact more closely, and in another paper we showed they also use different parenting styles, etc. But they're also more prosocial. And according to role model story, that all makes perfect sense, right? You have a role model, we imitate it. Of course, this could also be genes, right? We don't know. I mean, at this level, we don't know, right? But it's a positive intergenerational transmission, at least. Okay. Now, let me come to the causal analysis. Here's the hypothesis. A positive effect of participating in the mentoring program could come from the following. The program provides development-relevant resources that are scarce in low SES families. First, the prosociality of the attachment figure. Mentors are self-selected volunteers. So it's not surprising that they are very prosocial, right? Okay, so as we saw before, mothers are on average low in prosociality in low SES families. Now comes someone with high prosociality in this family context, okay? And in fact, they are more than a standard deviation more prosocial than low SES mothers. And even more prosocial than high SES mothers, I should say, on average. The intensity of social interaction, which I showed you just before, matters, descriptively at least, is actually the key idea of the program, right? It's all about close social interaction, as I pointed out, right? The share of intense interactive activities per afternoon in the mother-child relationship is 41% versus mentor-child is almost 100%. That's exactly why they are coming to see the child, right? Everyone who has kids knows exactly what I'm talking about. You know, here's the kid. I'm on the phone. You know, I have to do this. I have to do that. You know, oh, are you done with? Yeah, okay, fine. And you know, the mentor comes say, okay, let's play, let's talk. How was it? You know, that is more interactive. That's what I have in mind here. Okay, and therefore there might be scope for treatment effect, which in fact is what we find. The fact that these bars are higher than those is because they were standardized, and this is 2 years later. So let me first talk about the post-treatment wave 2. This is a couple months after the treatment was over. Okay, and these are all in standard deviations here. This is the control low SES, this is the control high SES. This comparison is the SES gap, the descriptive SES gap that I was mentioning before. And this is the treated low SES. And as you can see here, the gap between low and high SES is closed. This is actually more than closed, but it's insignificant. It's not significantly different from high SES. So in other words, a couple months after the treatment, the prosociality gap between high and low SES was completely filled. Okay, the gap doesn't exist anymore. That's low SES, high SES, but these kids are treated. These high SES kids are not treated. Now you could say this is all short-lived. It's going to fade away. Unlike institutional shifts, high versus low track that I discussed before, where there's some institutional pressure to keep people in particular tracks, so to say. Here you could say maybe it's just fading out, right? Weeks later it's gone. It's not. This is 2 years. This is a 2-year follow-up. This is wave 3. Control low SES, treatment low SES, control high SES. Again, no difference between these two groups, but significantly between these, and of course also between those groups. Okay. Causal effect of the environment on prosociality. Yes, please.
So this is a measure of prosociality among the children. Is the reason why there was this? It seems to be a significant increase after 2 years. Is this just
They all become more prosocial. They all become more prosocial.
Yeah, it's just part of the growing.
Yeah, exactly. The figure is a little misleading, perhaps. What's really important is this difference and this difference here. But to compare it over years, we chose this format, but it needs some further explanation. And it does reflect the fact that kids, and this is known, in cross-sectional studies, but it's also true in this longitudinal study that kids get more prosocial over time. Let me provide you a little more evidence on the credibility of what we do. I said that the mentor brings resources to the environment that were scarce, right? Which would mean that the interaction effect between prosociality of the mother and treatment should be bigger in families where the mother is low, scoring low on prosociality. This is exactly what we find. This is the treatment effect for the 30% of families where mothers are particularly low, scoring low on prosociality, and this is like the biggest treatment effect. This is where they are moderately low on prosociality, smaller treatment effect, yet significant. And this is if mothers are already very prosocial. It's a bit like learning a language, right? I speak German at home, and if someone comes and speaks German, there's not much added, right? If someone comes and speaks Russian or English, right, then all of a sudden, there's something new and can be imitated and enlarges the potential, right? That, I think, makes perfect sense. And we find exactly the same pattern for intensity of mother-child interaction. This first column shows what I just showed you graphically. Treatment dummy, positive, prosociality of mother, positive, prosociality times treatment, significantly negative, right? That's exactly what I showed you before. Same holds for intense mother-child interaction. It is positive, the treatment effect, then the intensity matters. And the more intense the interaction between mother and child was in a given household, the less relevant was the respective treatment. Okay, so summing this up is there's causal evidence on a positive effect of an enriched social environment. The gap is actually closed, and it remains closed. We've looked into this, of course, every single wave. At some point you have to publish a paper, right? You can't say, the referees say, look, why don't we wait another 5 years? Would be interesting. Yes, it would be interesting. No, we want to publish it, right? So, but trust me, I mean, the effects are still there. It's robust over time, and the mechanism, I think, is at least to me, quite convincingly, that it serves as a substitute for missing development-relevant inputs in low SSFN, like interaction, like role model of prosociality, etc. Okay, very similar to what we saw in terms of the schooling paper. Now I have 3 more papers, but very, very briefly. The question is, are you still willing to hear and listen? Yeah, good. Okay. There's no alarm. Warning. Cool. This is with Johannes Abler, a former student of mine, and Fabian Kosse. Here we look at malleability of preferences for honesty. And the paper is very similar to the one that you've just seen. Everything I show you holds conditional on our measure of prosociality, so I'm not telling you the same story twice. And I would argue, despite the fact that honesty preferences are correlated with social preferences, not the same. In fact, this is also many years later. Kids are much older here than in the prosociality paper. So now we are, I think, in wave 5 with this paper, right? I'm telling you none of the details here for time reasons, but there's nothing to hide, of course. Now, these preferences for honesty are very important, blah, blah, blah. Here's the design. Psychologists have used this before, I think, but in economics it was introduced mostly by this paper by Urs Fischbacher and Völmi Heusi in 2013. That's a variant of it. So here's the experiment. There's a kid. I tell the child, okay, here's a die. Think of a lucky number. Do you have a number in mind? It's any number from 1 to 6, maybe 5, maybe 2, whatever, right? Do you have a number in mind? Okay, then please throw the die. And then I tell you, if you throw if the outcome of the die roll is equivalent to the number that you thought about, then you get money. Okay? So you thought it's a 5, but then it turned out to be a 2, and now you're facing this conflict. You could say, oh yes, 2, that's exactly what I had in mind, and yes, here's the money, right? Or you stick with the truth and say, oh no, that was not what I thought I would get. The beauty of this setup is, it's not my setup, of course, but the beauty is we know exactly for groups how likely it is that you've rolled the number that you thought you might. It's 1/6, right? Because this is a perfect random device, right? So for groups, you can really say whether a group did lie or did not lie, or did lie more or less, right? For the individual, you can never tell, of course, right? Maybe this person actually thought it was a 2 or was a 5 or whatever, right? We are looking into gender effects, as always. Female are more prosocial, they lie less. We look at the SES gap, as always. There's an SES gap. High SES kids lie less than low SES. There's interaction effects, very similar to what I showed you before. Let me all not show this, but instead just very quickly, just the main outcome of the paper, which is a significant causal effect of the mentoring program. This is low SES control versus low SES control versus low SES treatment. The fact that this bar is smaller than this one means that these people say that they rolled the number less frequently, their lucky number, than they thought, than this group here. Okay, so this group lied significantly less than this group. So the mentoring program leads to more honesty, if you like. Okay. Now, does it mean this group is super honest? No, because they should say 16%, right? So there's a lot of lying going on here as well, right? But it is nevertheless reduced, right? And we explore some of the mechanisms in the paper. Now, a somewhat more different paper is this one, which I think is interesting because it's also looking into somewhat different, additional, I should say, inequality, which is gender inequality. And it looks into difference in competitiveness and earnings expectations. And it's with Theodora Boneva, Thomas Buser, who's been working a lot on competitiveness, and Fabian. Okay, in a nutshell, what is this paper doing? Why do we see wage differences? Why do we see the gender gap, right? Now, this is a one semester course. There's hundreds of papers and many theories and blah, blah, blah. One plausible partial explanation. So it's not the only one, and it's not maybe even the most important one, but one plausible partial explanation that has been put forward again and again by many people is gender differences in competitiveness, which are well documented, right? There's a preference for competitiveness that is more pronounced among boys than girls, males than females, etc. There's also some conflicting evidence, it's an ongoing field, but by and large, I think it is fair to summarize that there's a gender gap in willingness to compete, okay, or to shy away from competition. Now, how do these differences develop in childhood? What is the role of a social environment in this process? And here think about, in particular, female role models, right, who are successful because they're university students, amongst, 13, 14-year-old girls. This is the group that we are now talking about, because they are somewhat older than in the paper that you've seen before. So we look at gender difference in competitiveness by socioeconomic status, and then we look at whether we see a causal effect from the mentoring program on these competitiveness preferences. We used a competitiveness measure that has been developed by Buser, Niederlin, Oosterbeek, and we measure labor market expectations according to a paper by Boneva, Golin, and Rao. But again, for reasons of time, and I think I'd like to have at least 1 minute for final discussion, let me be brief here. What this figure shows is for girls and boys separately, willingness to compete by socioeconomic status. So it's in some sense two differences at the same time. It's a little more difficult to read than before. So what it shows is that gender differences in willingness to compete is about twice as large for low SES children compared to high SES children. So in some sense, low SES girls are twice disadvantaged, right? They are coming from low SES, and then they are particularly, shying away from competition. The difference in SES is exclusively coming from girls. There's no difference between boys, high and low SES, in willingness to compete. But as you can see here, for girls, there's a big effect. And the question is, can this effect be shrink? Can this gap become smaller in the presence of a female mentor? Right? Again, this is only high versus low, no treatment so far, right? And you can probably guess what it is. There's also intergenerational transmission. I'm skipping this. I find this fascinating. Mothers have a strong effect on their daughters. They don't have any effect on their boys. I've never seen that pattern before, but for competitiveness, it seems to be quite strong. So if the mother is willing to compete, the girl is willing to compete too. And guess what? There's an SES effect, as we've seen before. Okay, this is the causal effect on gender differences in competitiveness. This is low SES control. This is high SES. Again, there's a SES gap, and as you can see, this gap is closed for kids who were treated. So the SES gap in competitiveness vanished through the mentoring program, and the effect is coming completely by making girls more willing to compete, okay? Which I find quite interesting. And then the next question is, how does that translate into earnings expectations, and what does it do with earnings expectations? We asked these kids, age 14, I think they are, and I haven't looked it up, sorry if it, let's say 14, maybe it's not exactly 14, but roughly 14 years old. We asked them, what do you think will your wage be when you're 30? More or less. We asked more questions, but that's pretty much what it is. As you can see here, kids who are in the low SES control group are significantly more pessimistic about the wages they will make compared to kids that were treated. So the wage expectations amongst high SES kids are very similar to those of treated low SES kids, but much more optimistic in comparison to untreated low SES kids. Okay, so the wage expectations are very different and causally affected by the treatment. And then if you look at these gaps, conditional on willingness to compete, they almost collapse and go away, which suggests that if you correct willingness to compete, you also eradicate differences in wage expectations, and wage expectations are very important for future labor market outcomes. Okay? So that's a different angle how mentoring can affect prospects of kids through preferences for competition in this case, and leveling, let's say, differences in their earnings expectations. In some sense, it's totally trivial, right? You're shy, you think you're worthless, and then there comes this, let's say, strong, positive mentor. I mean, maybe I'm making this up a bit, but let's say I think this is pretty much what's going on, and says, look, no, you're good, right? No, you can do this, right? No, I like you, boosting self-confidence. Yes, I can compete too, right? And yes, I want a high wage too. Why not, right? End of story. And that's the story that I'm showing you here in figures and numbers, right? And I think that is in particular relevant in formative years, right? Early on, when life is, when you have everything in front of you. So let me conclude, and I'm really done now in one slide. Ultimately, I think happiness is the most important outcome that we could, from a societal perspective, probably be interested in. I'm skipping this here. This is my last slide, promise. I'm showing you here in one slide a paper that has not been written up yet on happiness in these three groups. Let me walk you through this real quick. As you can see here, there's three lines. The upper line is high SES control. The green straight line here, fat line, is low SES control. And the red dotted line here is low SES treatment. Okay? What I'm showing you here is development of life satisfaction starting at age 8 to age 16, right? Going from wave 1 to wave 8. This is a mean age, and these are the waves. They're almost every year, but not always exactly every year, okay? And there are two important messages. One is at the beginning, all these kids in all groups are very happy and there's no difference, right? Then as you get older, and this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the only panel that has ever done this for happiness in kids, satisfaction goes down, right? Life isn't that great anymore. And this is true for everybody, right? It goes down. But it goes down much faster for low SES than for high SES kids. And it's almost like, sadly, right, as if kids realize they're not born on the sunny side of life, right? Many things have happened in between, right? There was a school transition, you realize what are your opportunities, your chances, etc. I can only speculate, right? This is a summary statistic of a life, right? Who am I to say what exactly is the driver? But what we document is a sharper fall in life satisfaction for low than for high SES kids. And super interestingly, I think, the treated low SES are right in the middle, right? And consistently so. And if you look at the cumulative effects, red is for the SES gap and blue is for the treatment effect. At the very beginning, there's no SES effect and there's no treatment effect. Then the SES effect starts growing and growing. That's this difference between the blue and the green. And it's getting significant at the fourth wave when kids are about 11 years old, 11 to 12. And then from wave 6 onward, the treatment effect, this is from roughly from here, also gets significant. And then kids who were treated are more happy with their life than untreated kids, right? Okay. So, this is my last slide. Sorry. But then I'm done, promised. Social environmental effects such as parental background, traits, and SES critically shape preferences, skills, and therefore behaviors and outcomes. I think you've seen many indications of that claim. Inequalities early in life are therefore reinforcing. You know, you're born into an environment that is already different, and through various channels, this is reinforcing and stabilizing and perpetuating inequalities. And you can't do much about it because you're not choosing which family you're born into. But I think we've also shown that improving environmental conditions through mentoring, and this is just one example, and there are probably better mentoring programs and other programs, and some were mentioned by you, for example, educating teachers and whatnot, right? Have the potential to improve equality, and in that sense, I would argue that inequality is a choice. Thank you very much.